At the outset, I want to express my thankfulness to the organizer for having me here, but I am equally scared to speak amidst this august audience because I think when I heard the conversation in the first session, I thought there's a lot of learning from me here than what I'm going to share. Many of the things which I'm going to talk about is almost known to everyone, but the only thing I'm doing is I'm going to put the things in perspective. So I begin with the premise that NALSA and post 377, what has happened is a sharp division between queer subjects have begun to surface, and how within this division we try to locate the trans right in India and elsewhere. So they have begun to surface with trans subjects left to fight their own existential battle, while privileged queer articulate a homonormative and a homo-nationalistic uh, aspirations, and it becomes difficult for the isolated trans communities. I'm not underestimating the trans communities, but I'm just reminding, when Patricia Oberoi, she's a sociologist, is talking about the middle class's guiltless consumption, when the post-globalization happening, and then new cinema is coming. For example, Madhuri Dixit, Hum Aapke Hain Kaun? And then in our generation, for example, then she is talking about this, the song sequence which talks about chocolate, lime juice, Meri Saheliya. So there's a guiltless consumption. So she will eat chocolate, she will have lime juice and everything. All those things, and if you see the dogs and whatever menu is served, etc. In a family context, the whole labor process is being hidden, etc., etc. So what is the duty of middle class towards the working class? She's sort of trying to remind. So here I'm also trying to remind what is the duty of the privileged queer towards the most disprivileged queer community, and what is happening today. And that was really surfaced prominently during the COVID-19 pandemic. The division appears somewhat similar to those between working and lower middle class and the privileged classes in India. The media visuals of upwardly mobile middle classes and affluent families enthusiastically beating thalis and lighting lamps upon Prime Minister calls showing national solidarity and acknowledge contributions of frontline workers kept circulating during the pandemic lockdowns in March 2020, March-April, giving this occasion an aura of mass festive rituals. Parallel to this, the trauma and precarity of migrant workers, daily wage earners, street vendors, small shop owners continue to multiply and escalate. While the market offered designer masks and immunity boosters, to affluent consumers, and the business of leading pharmaceutical companies swelled with profiteering, the domestic workers and people in low-paid jobs bore the brunt of lockdown and other regulatory measures enforced by local authorities. Though life turned difficult for many women and queer persons, the most visible impact of pandemic was witnessed on the livelihood and existence of transgender communities. Transgender persons living both inside and outside the community life faced existential problem of food, medicine, transitioning and therapy, loss of sources of income and livelihood with very minimal state support. They would mostly survive through community support and the help rendered through NGOs and voluntary organizations to a limited extent. The mainstream media barely captured their plight. The Amnesty International surmised, as the world comes together, India's transgender community fight COVID alone. Posters were stuck in city of Hyderabad, for example, warning people not to talk to transgender person in case they contact coronavirus. This led to housing complexes asking transgender persons to vacate their rented accommodation. Facing intensified stigma and transphobia under the pandemic, the community wrote to Ministry of Finance, Home Affairs, and Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, urging immediate attention, considering their acute hardships. They demanded an assured subsistence income of 3,000 per month. So while this precarity was triggered by pandemic and its several lockdown phases, how does one understand the simultaneous filing of cases for rights to marry or marriage equality in Delhi High Court by certain gay and lesbian persons during the pandemic? With marriage rights for some, while loss of livelihood and precarity for others, is it pertinent to explore the priorities of divided queer groups in pandemic situation? It is equally important to ask whether the privileged queer filing cases in Delhi High Court for marriage equality have expressed any concern towards transgender persons' vulnerabilities. Following the court case hearing towards legalizing same-sex marriage, many supporters took to Twitter with hashtag HomoVivah, same-sex marriage. The term Vivah suffixed with homo is Sanskritized term, a formal Hindu expression for wedding. There are queer persons from Muslim, Dalit, Christian, and many other communities who may not identify with the term Vivah, as someone intervened on the Twitter storm Homo Vivah, why not Homo Nikah? For those minority queer persons, aspiring amendment of personal laws regulating their identity, marriage, property, and divorce, Homo Vivah appeared alienating and estranging, although marriage itself sounds unreasonable and normativizing for others. With hindsight, I submit that the same-sex marriage might become desirable for financially independent, individualistic, affluent queer person who, through their class positioning and financial security, can undermine and transcend community, caste, ethnic, racial, and even national boundaries, as many of our Adivasi trans sisters were articulating. It matters to them, but it doesn't matter to this privileged class of queer who can transcend those boundaries. In the Western context, for example, race and class privilege allow specific categories of queer to emulate dominant middle-class norms of marriage and family, engendering normalization of queer identity and its simultaneous depoliticization, offering itself to assimilation within an affluent middle-class consumptive culture. So whereas trans people are pushing for democratization and pushing for politicization, there is an intensive politicization we are witnessing in contemporary India of trans constituencies. You will see these privileged queer are happy with the civil rights. If the civil rights gets, and civil rights privatizes the politics, it relegates into the private background. So if I am married, the state leaves you. You are married, you take care of yourself. But here the trans communities are constantly asking the state to give us this, ensure this, institutionalize this, commit to NASA judgment, whereas the privileged queer are happy with the civil rights, the marriage rights. The critical queer perspective entails a diversity of queer lives and somewhat unsettled and unstable myriad ways of celebrating intimate relations and alternative kinship to pose a challenge to normative, monogamous, and patriarchal heteronormative intimacy and kinship arrangement. The equality advocates emphasize that marriage is a way of mainstreaming and normativizing queer communities, at both state and society upholds marriage as moral and superior human bond. Class and cultural privilege of those who filed cases for same-sex marriage, one can see, for majority of, can be contrasted with the majority among the queer communities. While the transgender community's existential battle throughout the ongoing pandemic, for the privileged queer, what mattered were civil rights, ensuring conjugality, inheritance, property rights, insurance nomination available to heterosexual citizens, read middle class. Andrew Sullivan, the anti-left face of gay movement in the US, urges the LGBT communities to move in the direction of homogeneity and to become more mainstreamed. Sullivan claims that in the years past, it was important for gays to rebel, but now gay marriage also places more responsibilities upon gays. It says that for the first time that gay relationships are not better or worse than a straight relationship, and the same is expected of them. It's clear and dignified. To Sullivan, idealizing gay marriage would offer homosexuals the same deal society now offers to heterosexuals. A related argument advanced by those who take assimilationist position is that same-sex marriage, like the major function of heterosexual marriages, would allow for raising children in a stable and socially sanctioned, highly functional, and economically viable setting. If one takes this position, then single and unwed mothers, female-headed households, single queer and transgender person might become disqualified for rearing and raising children. And that's what my friend has talked about, that reproductive rights and all that, and right to adoption. The oppositional position on same-sex marriage emphasizes that entering into monogamous marriage world amount to participation in patriarchal, oppressive, state-governed institution of marriage, creating new hierarchies within queer communities, with the highest tier reserved for those cushioned by marriage and further marginalize those who choose alternate. And the state will not be committed and responsible. They will say, now you've got marriage rights. You marry and you're fine, like heterosexual people. So trivializing the non-monogamous relation through a holistic, restrictive version of morality. So they are also trying to institutionalize a restrictive version of morality through monogamy. I go to American context also and take a comparative study of middle-class suburb of Maplewood, New Jersey, and its close, much larger and much maligned post-industrial urban cousin, Newark, that offers a clear illustration that queer people of color are, for a variety of reasons, including lack of access to capital, greater embeddedness in non-nuclear family and networks, feeling of loyalty to and belonging to racial ethnic minority groups, fear of stigma, and higher rates of religiosity among others, are less likely than their white middle-class counterparts to make sexuality a primary identity. And as many of the sisters who are from Adivasi background have been told, sexuality cannot be a primary identity. There are other issues which are simultaneous, and we need to talk about, there is a simultaneity related to the existence. Maplewood's affluent middle-class gays and lesbian, a fair chunk of whom have got into civil unions, want their neighbors to recognize them as different but also similar, as members of family-oriented middle class. They also want the state to grant them legal rights and economic benefits enjoyed by their heterosexual neighbor. So you can see, in contrast, the poverty-stricken Newark, the queer of color, consider marriage as a luxury and consider safe street, decent jobs, and access to quality health as priorities. So I'll not get into the many details of this. So I would say that elopements, unsuccessful attempts at marrying and escaping the tyranny of family and kinship by queer person did exist in post-colonial India. Photos of a few pompous and affluent gay weddings would emerge at times in glossy magazines and web giants for upmarket and executive class of readership. However, in post-377 India, what is new is an emphasis on legalization and demand for marriage equality vis-a-vis heterosexual married majority. What most concerned us is the petitioners' upwardly mobile, affluent middle-class status and the grounds on which marriage equality is justified. Did the marriage legalization reasoning of petitioners concern the majority of transgender persons in a pandemic context? The right to marriage would constitute civil rights without responsibilizing to the state regarding financial and infrastructural commitments. In contrast, the right to food, medicine, livelihood, access to gender-affirming needs, and HIV/AIDS treatment would require allocating and distributing those resources to the underclass. This specific temporality of corona pandemic revealed differing priorities of two different classes of queer. One seeking legality of marriage parallel to heterosexual couples. The more subaltern transgender persons were struggling to get a fair hearing from the state. They wanted their daily meals and modicum of an institutional mechanism to safeguard their emergency. Now I'll talk about the privileged queer class, and then I'll stop. I may have some time. There is no denying that the privileged classes of queer do have issues and problems compelling them to petition in the High Court for marriage legalization. Kavita Arora and Ankita Khanna, the two mental health professionals, are living together for past 8 years as partners. They filed a case in Delhi High Court in October 2020, citing the constitutional provision of justice and non-discrimination, while highlighting their difficulties in opening a joint bank account as a couple, in nominating a same-sex partner in the insurance policy, gratuity and pension, and applying for a passport. They invoked right to marry through a Special Marriage Act. The case of Kavita and Ankita was filed through Arundhati Karchu and Surbhi Dhar and argued in court by Menika Guruswamy. While joint bank accounts and insurance nomination and owning an apartment together are undisputed, the question is, why should marriage and conjugality be considered the only basis to claim them legally? What also concerned us here is the middle classness of the couple, their photos on media reflecting the aesthetic and sartorial sophistication, their status as mental health professional, and their foreign travel aspirations. Moreover, their case is filed and represented by two globally known women same-sex partners who made headlines in 2018 through their active role in reading down of Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code criminalizing homosexuality. Kajju and Guruswamy are affluent, have their legal education from the world's most prestigious universities, and constitute probably the role models for certain upwardly mobile same-sex person aspiring to get married and lead a consumptive, comfortable lifestyle. Kavita and Ankita in popular writings are described through unbreakable bond of two people who have come together in love. They are like any other couple you might meet. Their anxieties during the first wave of corona pandemic were described. While projecting the couple as victims of discriminatory law, the authors of such articles tacitly reinscribed conjugality and monogamy as superior to other intimacies and partnership. Jack Halberstam associates queer existence with wilderness. He theorizes the wild as an unbounded, unpredictable space that offers source of opposition to modernity's orderly impulses. While the unpredictability of life during pandemic compels Kavita and Ankita to think of entitlements such as joint bank account, insurance, inheritance, nomination, visitation right, what remains is in the background is monogamy, bounded love, aspired conjugality, and of course entitlements parallel to heterosexual monogamous couples. Menika Guruswamy and Arundhati Kajju, who filed and represented the case of Kavita and Ankita, speak of their marriage rights advocacy mission as marriage project. They were talking in their Oxford University when they were invited to talk about. They said that their project is called Marriage Project, citing this as central to Indian society. And they're also saying that marriage is central to Indian society. This implies that marriage is the most crucial gateway for LGBT acceptance in Indian society. In the Oxford Unity Society's invited speech following the decriminalization of homosexuality in India, Guruswamy proclaims, "We Indian are a marriage society." In Guruswamy's speech, there is a complete erasure of feminist and queer critiques on marriage being discussed and debated in India. Marriage inter alia is associated with dowry, domestic violence, unequal work burden, restriction on women's mobility, endogamy, which reproduces exploitative caste structure in India. Kajju and Guruswamy are tight-lipped and underplays these concerns in their formal speech. Suppose entitlements of, so I will not get into these details. So you see the two different worlds of trans communities, majority trans communities, and this privileged queer. So in the feminist movement, it is also said that when any movement is starting, how the energies of women are harnessed within the movement, right? And when it comes to power sharing, the women are relegated to the background. So trans communities have always been at the forefront, the Hijra communities and trans, hyper-visible, as my friend has talked about, the hyper-visibility of these entities in the LGBTQI movement right from the beginning. And the movement stands on the back of trans communities. But when it comes to fighting together a battle and pressurizing the state to ensure the provisions, at least within the Nalsa judgment, even if there is a lot of limitations of Nalsa judgment, the language, and there are other problems from Foucauldian perspective, many critics have critiqued it, the third gender category, etc., which it reinscribes. But at the same time, it is also a document of substantive justice, and the state is faltering to translate it into practice. So these privileged queer and all queer communities have to come together when they have fought the reading down of Section 377 together. And where are they now? They are talking about marriage, and in the pandemic, they are not even showing an iota of concern to the trans communities. And definitely there is an intersectionality within trans, and certain categories of trans people are also being co-opted by the state, and they are also within the assimilationist politics. And in this context, how do we imagine trans rights in India?